Everyone's ready to start. Welcome to Workshop 5. My name's Lucy. I volunteer with North London League Assembly and North London War. The title of this workshop is Investing in Not War, Scrap Trident. So Trident is Britain's nuclear weapon system, and its renewal, which the coalition government is in favour of, will cost around £100 billion. So we'll be discussing the various much better ways in which that money can be spent. So we have got a Russell Brand video to show you, but the sound may be an issue, so we'll give it a go and see how that works out. Ways we discuss sort of the funding crisis with the NHS and how the money that will possibly be spent on the new environment, in relation to that. We've got two fantastic speakers for you, the Economists Mick Burke, who contributed to CND's Not Trident report, and Chris Nineham, who is a National Officer of Stop the War Coalition and was one of the main organisers of the 2003 anti-war protest against the invasion of Iraq. So the video runs about 8 minutes, and then both speakers will speak for about 8 minutes, and we'll open up the floor up and take as many questions as we can. So we can try and keep your questions concise so we get as many in, and then we'll come back to speakers at the end of our sort of 10 minutes. So we'll try the video first. Fingers crossed it's out. Yeah, all right.
Welcome to the Truths. I'm Russell Brand. In the middle of an election, people are using the NHS as a kind of football. How privatised should it be? Seems to be the questions and ideas behind both our major parties. But is there another option? Is there funding from elsewhere that could be used to support the NHS? Let's have a look at some truths.
For weeks now, the NHS in England has been struggling to cope with the extra demands of winter. The pressure can be seen as patients face longer waits for ambulances and at accident and emergency departments. Senior NHS managers have admitted the system is creaking as winter takes hold.
Here's some information about nurses. In London, nurses who took time off because of stress, anxiety or depression during 2014 was up 27%. 1 in 29 nurses were off ill with stress.
The plan later today will shed new light on whether the NHS is hitting A&E targets. 95% of patients should be admitted, treated or discharged within 4 hours. But recent months have seen growing pressure and performance has declined.
Here we see how the news participates in narrative. The way this story is presented is later there'll be some targets. Will the targets have been met? Let me tell you now, they won't have been. Then what will happen if people say that NHS needs private investment, and then people will argue about the degree of private investment that it requires.
The post-Christmas period often sees an increase in demand for NHS services, and in recent weeks a number of hospitals, including most recently 2 in Gloucestershire and Scarborough Hospital in Yorkshire, have had to declare what are called major incidents after facing an unprecedented surge in demand.
So you can see that a narrative is being built that implies that the NHS is short of funding and is in deterioration and new ideas are required, and probably that much we can agree with.
We have an independent nuclear deterrent in our country, the Trident submarines, and soon we're going to have to make the decision about whether to replace that on a proper like-for-like basis. And I strongly believe that we should replace it on a like-for-like basis.
As the NHS struggles against a £2 billion funding gap this year, the money diverted into Trident, £3.3 billion being spent in the assessment phase, not to mention the £2 to £3 billion spent every year just running our current Trident system, reflects the choice our government has made. So the NHS needs £2 billion. £3.3 billion is being spent assessing Trident's needs.
The Vanguard submarines will be phased out of service in the mid-2020s. So a decision on their replacement must be taken by 2016. To design and build 4 new nuclear submarines will cost an estimated £20 billion.
Recently, further funds were diverted into nuclear programs. This is how it happens. It's not that someone announces it, we're going to spend some more money on nuclear weapons. This is how it happens. There's an announcement where Michael Fallon, the Defence Minister, says, I'm publishing this thing, the United Kingdom's future nuclear deterrent thing. A copy's been placed in the library house. It's really sly, isn't it? There's a thing in the library you might want to look at. Well, if you went down the library in a house, what it would say is that the Ministry of Defence has reprofiled £261 million of funding into the assessment phase of Trident. In this case, £261 million of taxpayers' money has been reprofiled from requiring parliamentary authorisation to not requiring parliamentary authorisation. So its identity used to be Parliament's got to authorise funds of this nature being moved over to Trident. Oh, I don't like that profile, should we give it a new one? Yeah, what should it be? But it doesn't require that.
BAE Systems, the British defence giant, has made a fortune selling high-tech military hardware to governments across the world. But the firm's been dogged by long-running allegations of bribery and corruption. Now it hopes to draw a line under the claims by pleading guilty to 2 criminal charges.
BAE are one of the firms that do well out of Trident and missile development and the arms industry. I wonder why that is. Well, it might be that a lot of people that worked for the military or in government now work for BAE. Someone called Sir Sherard Cowper-Coles. He's so posh, Sir Sherard Cowper-Coles, that none of the words in his name are real words. BAE Systems earned 43 billion from selling arms to Saudi Arabia, and Cowper-Coles, a Sherpa Systems International Business Director, with a particular focus on the Middle East. There's a relation there. Al Portillo, you remember him, he was former Secretary for the State Defence, became a non-executive director of BAE Systems. John Reid, former Defence Secretary, became Group Consultant to G4S, one of the Ministry of Defence's partners in Iraq. Jeff Moon, former Defence Secretary, awarded £1 billion contract to Augusta Westland and then went on to become its Vice President.
The UK government is determined to pour billions of pounds upgrading its nuclear deterrent, citing evolving threats from North Korea and Iran. Experts, however, question whether North Korea does pose an actual threat to the UK. It's about how far its most sophisticated missile systems can reach. It includes Japan and South Korea, but not Britain.
Arms firms and the government are an interrelated entity. People that work in government go on to work for arms firms. Arms firms probably have relationships with people while they're in government. So the people that are in government now likely have relationships with them. So that's why there's an entrenched and unchangeable relationship. That's why you never get to vote for, well, can't we just spend that 2 billion from Trident on the NHS?
The British government has released its annual arms export report. The report shows that the UK government sold at least £12 billion worth of military equipment to foreign nations, the vast majority of whom are named on the government's own list of countries of concern, which the Foreign Office allege are major violators of human rights.
What's the point of having a list if you're going to continue to sell weapons to them? The minimum thing you could do to a group of people on a list that are only on that list because of human rights abuses is not to sell them stuff to do human rights abuses with. Well, we did the list, didn't we? We can't take it to ridiculous extreme.
The previous government set a criterion that if there were fears that arms would be used for internal repression, the sales could be suspended. Current Business Secretary Vince Cable quietly dropped this restriction, allowing the UK to sell arms to countries like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, who feature in the report as large buyers of British weapons.
If you care about the Trident issue, there is a march on Saturday, Wrap Up Trident. There's a demonstration in London. If you'd like to support the NHS, you can support the National Health Action Party, or you can support Unison, one of the unions for people who work for it, or support Frontline First, which empowers nurses to have a voice. This, I think, is an interesting perspective from Satish Kumar, who's like a yogi, swami sort of fella, talking to the intellectual and campaigner for nuclear disarmament, Bertrand Russell, in the 60s, when all these deals were made, when agreements were made to get rid of nuclear weapons that are still being profligated. He had a conversation with this guy, Satish Kumar, and points out this: nuclear weapons did not emerge from nothing. There's a whole social and political culture behind the bomb. If you take away the bomb without questioning that culture and the dualistic, materialistic mindset which goes with it, you will get something else equally dangerous. What he's saying is we need to change our consciousness, we need to change individuals. Then there won't be the fuel in consciousness to materialise these weapons. Bertrand Russell says, we can't make the case for peace in such broad terms. We're in danger of diffusing, dissipating and blunting the argument. We want to stop the nuclear arms race now. That is the only issue at stake at this moment. That was speaking in the late 60s. These issues continue. You can go along to that march on Saturday, or like me, you can consider what are the spiritual components of consciousness that bring this about. How do you change the machinery of democracy so that the will of the people can be demonstrated? How do you get a properly funded NHS? Is it at the expense of the arms industry? The answer is obviously yes. That is some true news. Subscribe here, subscribe here.
So following straight on from that, on the issues of
Yeah, well, thanks very much for the invitation. One of the things in a different broadcast that Russell Brand refers to is a publication that was produced by C&D called People Not Trident, which actually itemises some of the things that you can do with the not inconsiderable amount of money you'd save, 100 billion you'd save by not renewing the Trident missile system. And it's a hell of a lot. 100 billion buys you quite a lot of hospitals, it buys you quite a lot of education, it buys you an awful lot of new homes. And I want to highlight the key discrepancy that we're living under in terms of ideology, is that at the same time as we're told there's no money left, there is money for nuclear weapons and indeed for the military budget. I don't want to stray on to what I call the Chris's territory, but it's the extraordinary position we're in currently, where the US State Department is coordinating a campaign in British politics for a military budget in this country of over 2% of GDP. And when the US State Department snaps its fingers, you get leaders of both main political parties, or I should say the three main political parties, saying how high do you want me to jump? And it's an absolute scandal that it's taking place. Not least, it would be a scandal at any time, but not least at a time when virtually every other budget is facing cuts. And I think it highlights something very important. The Trident weapons system is not an independent deterrent. Even if you don't, if like me, you don't believe in nuclear deterrence at all, it's not even an independent one, i.e. it would require US authorisation to actually use. The only point at which that would occur, presumably, is unless Britain, the US had a particular animus against Britain and wanted it to get blown to smithereens, is at a time when there was a global nuclear conflagration and Britain would be chipping in its bit just to make sure someone would fire missiles at it. I.e. it's a useless weapons system. And the purpose of it is to make sure that there isn't any daylight at all between US military policy and British military policy. But we should be clear about who's in charge of that alliance. It's the US it's that alliance. Ever since Suez, British governments have decided that it's absolutely disastrous to do anything that the US doesn't want it to do, and has pursued that doggedly throughout the entire period since, taken to new depths by Tony Blair, of course, who is almost egging on a pro-war US president to go further and quicker than even he was thought wise at certain points. The special relationship was it's a fiction. It was an invention of Winston Churchill's after Britain failed to create its own nuclear weapons, and then suddenly decided there was a long-term historic special relationship between Britain and the US. And there's a reason for this. Britain has had an empire, and it doesn't anymore. But the unfortunate fact of life is that consciousness lags reality. It takes people an awful lot of time to wake up to change. And that's changed. But British governments, and I would have to say large sections of British society haven't really woken up to it. And we've been chased out of various places in Afghanistan and Iraq. And yet we now see never-ending parades of service people. You can barely go to a football match in this country without a collection of our heroes. And what it is, it's not about the service people, because really, if you don't want them traumatised and you don't want them killed, don't send them to foreign countries. That's really the answer. What it's about is creating a mythology that Britain is a very strong military power. 100 billion is an awful lot to spend supporting a myth, and that's what's being done in our name. Now, I could enumerate, and what I suggest actually is, I'm sure CND has got a lot of copies of this, people are interested, I'm sure it's on the website, notes on the website, to go through all the different aspects of the economy that could be transformed, many of them simultaneously, using the money that would be saved by not renewing the Trident missile system. An even greater amount could be saved and redirected towards investment if we cut ourselves, not to this, raise ourselves up to some ridiculous 2% target that no one else in NATO needs apart from the US. No other country, I think Romania might do. With the greatest respect to Romania, that's not threatening to many other countries. What Britain does threaten many other countries with in alliance with the US. Getting away from that and cutting the military budget to something sensible, a bit more like Germany's. You know, Germany's hardly a feeble power in danger of imminently being overrun. Its military budget is about 1.1% of GDP, i.e. half what Britain spends. We seem to bemoan the loss of aircraft carriers. Aircraft carriers are a wholly offensive weapon. They're designed to put aircraft in a particular place very rapidly. You don't need aircraft carriers. You want to defend your country because you've got land. I.e., you can keep the planes here. You don't need aircraft carriers are about the projection of overseas power. But here I just want to, with my economist hat, I want to a very dirty little secret. This campaign that's being run by the US currently is in complete contradistinction to what it's doing. Because the US economy, like all the other Western economies, was in a mess after the global financial crisis. And it, for a short period, pursued austerity. And the economy went even lower, again, just as happened in Britain and Europe. And it made a change. What the US did was it cut its own defence budget, what it calls defence, it cut its military budget, and shifted it about 1% GDP towards investment. Public investment in things like infrastructure and so on, i.e. the type of stuff that lefties like me go on about all the time is actually the way to lift the economy out of its slump. And what it's doing now, pursuing its own interests, it's demanding that other countries in NATO make up the shortfall in its military spending in order that it can do two things simultaneously, which is actually incapable of on its own, which is growing the US economy and projecting its own might across the world, because it can't do both, it doesn't have the resources to do both. And what it's intent on doing is getting the rest of NATO to do it for it, to pay for its own defence cuts. And who are the saps, who are the idiots, who are the patsies who have said, me sir, I'll go first? It's the British political establishment. And that's the real scandal that's going on.
Thank you very much. Well, as Mick says, the kind of questions we're discussing here are far from being abstract. I mean, this is a very, very live debate. There's a campaign going on which is being pushed, as Mick says, by the US State Department to try and insist that the European economies increase their military spending, and Britain is the kind of first in line for this kind of pressure, and it's being taken up by a whole number of people on the right and by the military very, very strongly, and there's a kind of debate going on as we speak in the British establishment. Cameron, to be honest, is on side. I mean, there's different messages coming from different parts of the political establishment, but David Cameron has actually pledged already an extra 1%, so that's a 1% increase per year in the military budget after the general election. This is a kind of part of the whole debate in the run-up to the general election. So the government is essentially already on board with this target and some. Now, listening to the right and to the generals and to the people from the US, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Britain is a kind of beleaguered island with only a kind of ramshackle dad's army standing between us and the hordes massing on the continent ready to invade. That's the kind of picture that we're being presented here, which is obviously far from being the truth. But there's a big, I mean, you know, people are really saying some pretty wacky things at the moment, including that Russia is a military threat to Britain as we speak, just because it's thrown a couple of ageing reconnaissance aircraft over Cornwall in the last couple of months. You know, there's this sense being developed here that really we're on the brink of being, you know, invaded by someone or other. And of course, behind that is all the stuff about terrorism and about the sort of, you know, this somehow that ISIL is a threat as well to Britain. Now, the reality, of course, is very, very different from this. In fact, Britain is, by some counts, the third biggest military spender in the world. It's, by most counts, got the fourth biggest army or fourth biggest military apparatus in the world, and is the second biggest arms exporter in the world. So what we're really talking about when you get down to the reality is a cutting edge army, is a big army on the world stage, is one of the most militarized countries in the world. And of course, the money that's being spent, the money that they want, the right want us to spend, and the money that is spent in the military budget, certainly the extra money over the last 14 or 15 years hasn't been spent on defence at all. It's been spent on attack. It's been spent on a series of wars that have caused absolute misery and carnage in various different theatres, actually against the opinion, in defiance of the opinion of the vast majority of the public. So this whole image that they're trying to create at the moment to justify these increases is based on a series of myths. And I think it's important to understand that what's really at stake here is nothing to do with our security, it's nothing to do with our vulnerability. What it's to do with is a particular project for British capitalism that involves essentially, in shorthand, financialisation at home and militarisation at home and abroad. What I think James there actually, I can see him in the audience, James Midway christened as essentially a policy of banks and tanks. And I think really that is what they're really trying to sell through this kind of, you know, narrative that is being intensified at the moment. Now, I mean, it's worth saying, Russell's put the case very well, but it's worth just underlining that the amounts of money that we're discussing here are serious. We are talking about things that actually make a real impact on the economy. It's not marginal. When people talk about 2%, it makes you think, you know, oh, that can't actually make much of a difference. But cumulatively, and certainly when you add in Trident replacement and when you add in subsidies to the arms industries, we're talking about a huge amount of money. The Afghan war, an example, £40 billion spent by Britain alone in the absolutely catastrophic war in Afghanistan that was being celebrated on Thursday by the British establishment. To compare, that's twice as much as the £20 billion worth of cuts that have been made to the NHS since this government came into office. So, you know, those cuts could have been not just reversed, but actually we could have spent extra money on the NHS if Afghanistan hadn't happened. The military budget, the annual military budget is £43 billion. Again, that gives you some idea of where we're at. The amount of money that is spent just on the kind of campaigns to recruit people to the army, where they go into schools and try and con kids into joining up and going to universities and cinemas and so forth, just the amount of public taxpayers' money that is spent on trying to get people into the army is twice as much as was saved by the introduction of or as was made for the government by the introduction of the bedroom tax, £450 million. So, I mean, you know, this is serious money. This does make a difference. What we are talking about is the kind of priorities we want to see in our societies, what kind of society we want to live in going forward. Now, just to conclude, I'll say this is why I just want to make a couple of strategic points, really, in terms of the movement, because I think this is one reason why it is very important that throughout the movements against austerity and the various different campaigns that we're all involved in, the question of arms spending, the questions of the military, the questions of the wars has to be constantly raised, because it is such a central question for British capitalism. It needs to be a central question for us, and we all need to be able to argue on the central justifications and rationales. We all need to be able to argue why the crisis in Ukraine, for example, has actually been caused by NATO expansion and not by Putin, essentially, as they're trying to tell us. We all need to be able to argue why it is that further military intervention will not do anything to halt the terrible threat created in the Middle East by ISIS. We all need to be able to argue that actually ISIS is more the product of what's happened, of the interventions that have taken place in the Middle East over the last 14 or 15 years. Because we need to win the argument more widely in society, and that's very, very important. I mean, there is another, there are a series of other reasons why I think these arguments are important for all of us. One of them is just generally, I think we should be against these foreign wars in their own terms. I think they've caused absolute misery and carnage in large parts of the world, and that's a reason to oppose them in its own right. I also think that accompanying the war on terror is an assault on the Muslim community in this country, which is beginning to alarm me quite seriously. I think it's intensifying, and clearly the current situation in the Middle East is making it worse. And I think that many of the techniques of infiltration and surveillance that have been developed in the foreign wars in Iraq, in Afghanistan, are now being turned against the domestic Muslim community in this country in a way that is really quite alarming. And I think it's toxic for Muslims. I also think there's a really serious danger, given the amount of propaganda that is being thrown into developing this kind of racism at the moment. It's in danger of dividing society and therefore seriously weakening our ability to resist the government's project. So I'll just end by saying that I think it's crucial that these arguments and these debates and these explanations are central to the movement in general, and that we mustn't allow ourselves to be divided. We very much need to stand together against war, against Islamophobia, and in favour of a completely different set of priorities for our future. Thanks.
Now, so hoping to see a sea of hands.
I suppose 2 points really. I think in our language about Ukraine, we have to be careful that we don't sound like we're not tacitly supporting Putin, obviously, but we just need to make sure that it's very clear that we think Putin's a repugnant regime or whatever. The second thing I thought is obviously that the idea of an SNP Labour coalition, which obviously horrifies the elite and the Conservative Party. I remember very, very vividly in 2010 the guys in purple who were campaigning for free votes now as those coalition negotiations were taking place. And they're always being, that made it basically on the agenda or whatever, especially for the news reporters outside on College Green. And I think it would be really good for us to do the same thing if that was the reality, that there was an SNP Labour decision taking place, to make it clear that when Tory politicians come on and say, that scrapping Trident will, for some reason, mean that we'll be in a national riot. With people on the College Green saying, no, actually, we can do something about this, and we can make a loud noise during those 4 or 5 days, because that is a real window of opportunity. That's the only point on my. Somebody's going to direct action during that period.
Thank you. Any questions, Sean?
Just thank you both. I think that was really informative and really useful, because I think this is a really good session in that. I'm involved in Stop the War, and it's always struck me that actually the amount that we spend on war and are going to spend on a Trident replacement actually really cuts to the heart, the hypocrisy of the austerity argument. It really exposes the lie that there isn't money for public services and benefits, and really highlights the fact that it's about the political choices that those in power make. And I think the CND survey recently, where they surveyed Labour and UP prospective parliamentary candidates, showed that 75% of those people thought that they shouldn't be Trident replacements. I think it's also actually, because of the kind of narrative around austerity that this current government set, actually also this is an open debate, and we can really make gains and really build a wider public support around spending this money on Trident. So I think it's really, really useful, and I think, and it would be good to know, how people think that that argument is going to develop in the next few months. As in contrast to the debate on austerity and how there's no money, I think the gulf between that and the need to spend money on Trident is just going to widen and jar with more of the public. So it'd be good to hear sort of what the speakers feel about that.
Thank you. Daniel?
Yeah, more of a comment on some other ways in which I feel that the anti-war movement, C&D, and I would say in particular Stop the War Coalition, have contributed to and are huge assets to the anti-austerity movement. So apart from the arguments which the anti-war movement develops and puts forward, popularizes that we have heard, it has also helped, and I hope will help in the future, to build the kind of media and organizational infrastructure of the left up and down the country through local groups. And to give just two examples with the media, say the Stop the War Coalition has around 110,000 people following it on Facebook. Recently, an article which was published on the website, within one day it was seen by 200,000 people. So this is a really significant media infrastructure for the left more broadly. And in terms of the organizational infrastructure, it is these local groups and the national organization, of course, the ability to mobilize, build large events, and to kind of open the door for the left and the anti-austerity movement in the social constituencies where the left is usually not as successful, say the Muslim community and so on. So these are some of the other additional examples how the anti-war movement is relevant for the anti-austerity movement as well.
Thanks to the thanks to speakers. Partly the sort of 13 or plus years of the war on terror is kind of on one side it's sort of it's delegitimized a lot of political process. The kind of democratic deficit in this country was created by this. Nobody agreed with these wars. It was supported by both Tory and Labour. What's the difference between the two parties and so on? So that kind of triangulation of people coming together with just kind of, I think Tariq Lee described it as the extreme centre, the sort of the political spectrum. I think that whole kind of ganging up of the elites over the question of war feeds into the fact that they're ganging up over the question of austerity. So anything that kind of weakens their hold over these ideological arguments around war has a knock-on effect to their ideological hold over arguments around austerity. And I think so that's a big part of why we these kind of questions out there. And then there are other issues like a question, how do you, for example, bring the Muslim community into campaigning against austerity? Obviously they are involved to an extent and so on, but the fact that unemployment, especially in London, is the highest amongst Muslims, so they're experiencing first-hand austerity, and at the same time, often the countries that they've come from are countries that we've been bombing for the last kind of 15 years. That's a very intense set of experiences that the community's been having. So one, we need to solidifize them so that the Muslim communities don't feel alone. But also, I think the kind of links that we made up, we need to step up those kind of links inside the anti-austerity movement, because the left did make links with the Muslim community over the war, and those can bear fruit. I think that's very important that we do that. And linking it up to the anti-racism demo next week. The anti-Islamophobia thing is something that we should all be supporting, whether we're against wars or austerity. Obviously, we're against both in this case. I think these arguments that can often seem difficult because of the way it's such a especially the prevent agenda, things like this. Actually, taking on these arguments gives people confidence. If you duck the issues, actually people aren't as confident in you to actually have alternatives to austerity if you can't take on these big kind of pressing issues. I think that's also why it's very important that we kind of link these two issues up very, very tightly, really.
Okay, thanks, James, and then lady in front.
I really like both introductions. It got into the thing that I think links both austerity and the continued presence are really extraordinary. When you sit down and look at extraordinary levels of military spending here, is that what you're looking at around Trident and austerity and the rest of it is this common theme of essentially this is a kind of story of decline. There's a story of not just decline here, this is a country that is and was the largest, most powerful state on the planet with an empire and all the rest of it, a decline from that point, but also a sort of more general decline and a shift in how capitalism operates, in that its older centres of accumulation, particularly in what was the West, so North America here, Europe, are simply not as important and as powerful relative to the world economy as they were even 10 years ago, never mind where they'll be in 10 years' time. And what we've got out of this, I think, is a ruling class strategy that Chris, quoting me was a bit weird, but Chris called tanks and banks, that you have a ruling class that looks at a country that otherwise has precious few reasons for Britain to maintain its peculiarly large presence internationally, beyond the fact that you have basically a major centre of the global financial system sitting in your capital city, and you have an extremely large army which you've been busily using over the last 13, 14 years or so. You've been aggressively using the thing, and the combination of these two things means that you have a ruling class that is suddenly important. And if you start to chip away at those two things, you have a ruling class that is less important. And the underlying bit here, if you're talking about why these two things come together and how they interrelate, and why you might start pushing on one of those things, which is military spending, increased military aggression, and why it relates to austerity, is precisely, I think, a strategy which basically boils down to these are the only two games in town. And then if you want to try and challenge austerity, you end up also running into a fundamental part of our ruling class strategy, which is you also end up having to challenge its military spending and the presence of an extremely large British Army, Navy and the rest of it, and the capacity of our state to use them. That you run up dead against an important part of what our ruling class is up to.
Hi, yeah, thanks very much. I think it was all good, including Russell Brand's video, which is my first point really. I think it's really important to stand up for Russell Brand. I think he's doing a fantastic job. He's got a massive number of followers. That is why he's being vilified, and it's important to make that argument, and not everybody on the left will support him. Second thing, I think a crib sheet on being able to make the arguments on all the key international points and wars and would be excellent. Trying to keep up with environmental science, it's a bit difficult trying to keep up with the other stuff. So I think that would be really, really good. And what was the third? Yes, London CMD's December-January newsletter had lots about the non-proliferation movement and the denuclearisation movement. And actually it was something I knew nothing about, didn't read before, and put us in perspective. You know, when you think of sort of, 190 other countries talking about these handful of enormous nuisances in the world, I think that's really powerful, and it's certainly nothing that gets talked about in everyday life. And I think we have got to look at for ways of challenging the colonial mentality, which even those of us who are socialists have an analysis of it. It's hard to be beyond it, and some things really, we've got to look for things that stand up and help do that. And I thought that was really good hearing about what the non-proliferation movement is doing, and they've got some conferences coming up. So I think that would be another good issue to work on and pursue and try and get some profile for. And a Russell Brand video would be good on it, wouldn't it?
Apparently he's going to, the way his traffic generating, he'll outstrip Daily Mail, I think, by May.
Excellent. I'll try and get my mother watching.
Thank you very much for all the contributions and questions, and we'll go straight back to the speakers for about 2 minutes each, if that's okay.
Yeah, I just want to end I want to begin with where the discussion ended, which is, I think it's really important to focus on the fact that the rest of the world isn't Britain, and Britain isn't representative of the rest of the world. And actually, the military actions of this government are not only repugnant to actually the majority of people in Britain, they're repugnant to a majority of people in the world. So when we make these arguments, Dan makes a very good point, sometimes it's hard to make these arguments because you are in the minority arguing for it. But actually, most people in the world support what we're arguing for. They don't want continual wars and invasions by Britain and the US. And sort of lean on that power sometimes and think of ourselves as part of that global movement and that global majority, because I think that's a very powerful way of seeing ourselves. In terms of some of the other points, just very briefly, even this whole stuff about 2% of GDP is a fiction. As Chris talked about, it's a serious amount of money. And in terms of government spending, it's about 5% of all government spending. But as Stiglitz and his colleague Linda Blime said about in their book, The $3 Trillion War, he basically had to reconstruct US government accounts because he said there's so much fakery, accounting tricks and so on, in order to disguise the real military budget. For example, take one obvious example which applies here, the impact on the health service, which goes way, a long tail, in some cases, for the whole life of the service personnel afterwards. That's on the health budget. It's not on the military budget. And Cameron, in trying to get numbers up, because he's in a tight spot, said, oh, well, of course, we spend all this enormous amount of money on military pensions as well, which wasn't previously included, and we spend an awful lot of money on spying, which is also really part of the military budget. You keep pressing it, you'll find out how astronomically high the real military budget is. In terms of, and I think we should, because I think that brings home to people, I think also we have to be clear, in terms of the banks and tanks, which I like, I think it's very good, I'm sure I'm going to use that and pretend I invented that. But it's a fundamental economic reason. Britain and the United States don't have net overseas assets. It's a technical point, but they owe money to the rest of the world. And yet they have a huge inflow of income. Now, if you speak to people on Wall Street in the City of London, they'll tell you it's because they're really smart, the rest of the world is really stupid. It's actually because, but the reality is, you can't keep taking money from someone that owes you money unless you do something else, which is put a knife to their throat. And that's what that military budget is about. It's about putting a knife to the throat of the rest of the world. And that's to support our key rulers, i.e. big business and big banks and the political representatives that we have in this country. And they are our enemy, just like they're the enemy of the rest of the world.
Just on the thing about the democratic deficit and the wars, I mean, I think it's an important point. And actually, if you think it through, I mean, the reason people do oppose wars, the majority oppose wars, and the reason why people get so angry about them is because foreign wars are the most brutal, barbaric expression of a brutal, barbaric system, if you know what I mean. And so, there's a certain logic in the idea that being anti-war or campaigning against wars actually does mobilise people, or potentially can mobilise people on quite a scale, and can then feed back into opposition to the system more widely. I think at the moment, and hopefully this will be a permanent problem, but it may not be. I think at the moment the movement has a particular difficulty, which is that the level of intervention that Britain's involved in is not particularly high at the moment. It's kind of, more proxy wars, more arming various different people, bombing raids that aren't reported very much, and so on and so forth. So that makes the argument about, where does ISIS come from, for example, slightly more difficult than if we were involved in a full-scale invasion stroke occupation. And this is why, funnily enough, there's such a premium on quite difficult political arguments and making sure that we hold the line on those arguments. And I think, we do actually do crib sheets and fact sheets, and they're very, very popular. Here's one on Islamophobia. We've got a whole load, but we need to do more. You're absolutely right. And I think that needs to be done. On the Ukraine thing, clearly, I absolutely agree. We don't want to get ourselves in a situation where anyone can say that we're pro-Putin or pro-Russia. Absurd though that accusation might be. Having said that, personally, I think whatever we say, that's what the establishment is going to call us. Just like no one seriously thinks, honestly, that we support ISIS. That doesn't stop the politicians saying, oh, you're apologists for terrorism, you know what I mean? So, in a certain way, while making sure we make no hostages to fortune, so to speak, we also have to be prepared that we will be under attack by the establishment. They'll try and say we're traitors, we're pro-Russian, and so on and so forth. The important thing is, and we do what we can to bat that one back, but we won't be completely successful. The important thing is we need to breach the complete unanimity in the mainstream, which is saying that Putin is responsible for expansion, that it's, that it's all about Putin, that it's all about Russia. We are a lone voice on this question. Almost no one else is saying this, and that's where we have to concentrate our energies and our fire on that question, because once you get a moment to actually express the argument that 12, 13 countries have been acceding into NATO since 1992 in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, the facts speak volumes. The facts actually support us very, very clearly, but we need to get that message out. Just two other quick things. One is on the issue about Islamophobia and the Muslims. I mean, I do think in terms of building links with maintaining and sustaining our links and strengthening our links with the Muslim communities, being clear on the war issues is absolutely crucial. And what the Prevent so-called strategy is actually doing is closing down any discussion. I mean, we hear constantly stories about groups of for example, school kids in largely Muslim schools in East London and so forth. They're too frightened now to even discuss any of the questions about the Middle East or the wars in classes or anywhere else, because they're worried they're going to be shocked that the teacher's going to tell them, inform someone, that they're going to get a knock on the door from the security services, they're going to be interrogated, literally, they're going to be interrogated and these kind of things. That's what the Prevent strategy is doing. It's making it impossible to discuss these issues, and discussing these issues is what is necessary. And again, that's why I think the anti-war movement is so important, because we are a website, which, as Daniel says, an online and a physical presence and a space where people can come and have a sensible discussion about the wars, where we can say to people there are ways of opposing the barbarity of these foreign wars that actually make sense and actually can be effective. So that's another reason why I think the anti-war movement is so important. And just finally on the colonial mentality, I mean, I agree completely with what people are saying. I mean, time after time, the question you get from the media, from the journalists, from the presenters is, but surely you're not saying we should do nothing, blank space about Iraq, about Afghanistan, about Russia, whatever. But there's this sort of implication that Britain has this responsibility to do something, in some foreign, civilizing mission in some foreign clime, which is completely a hangover from darker times. But and I think it's very important that we have the confidence to say, well, actually, we don't think, I mean, I'm not saying this is the only answer you can give to that question, but one of them is just that I don't think really it's any of our business. As a Democrat, I believe these things have to be sorted. However difficult they have to be resolved by the people on the ground. And we shouldn't get drawn into the idea that we always have to have some solution that can be imposed or mounted from London that will help the poor benighted people of Syria or wherever. I think it's quite important that we're prepared to take that position. Just finally on that, I mean, the other thing about it, I mean, it is a hangover. It is a kind of nostalgia for imperial times, but it's not just that. It's also that actually the policy of the British ruling class is to hang on in there and still be a colonial power, however minor a colonial power, however weak a colonial power. This is amazingly, it may be a fantasy, but it is the fantasy of those people that are in charge and those people who are ruling us. They want to be able to continue to intervene. They want to be able to continue to shape foreign governments, to influence foreign regions of the world right across the globe. And that's why they're constantly coming back to this. It's not because they care, obviously. It's because they want to increase their influence in all these different regions. And it's up to us to break that.
Closing rally is happening sort of very, very now downstairs, so we're going to rush it downstairs. And also we have got a forum on the 8th of April, which is all about structure, talking about ground and drones and touch base. So do take the flight and receive